The hull breach alarm had been screaming for 9 seconds before Corin Vale killed it with her elbow and started counting bodies. 3 unconscious. 1 dead technician Burrell, neck twisted wrong against the bulkhead seam where the overhead compartment had collapsed. The rest were moving, which meant they could wait. The shuttle's nose was buried 6 meters into basalt, windshield fractured into a web of white lines lit by the one emergency strip still drawing power. Through the cracks she could see the color of the sky outside, deep rust, darkening fast. "We have maybe 40 minutes of light," she said, not loud, just enough to carry over the hiss of equalizing pressure through the hull fractures. Navigator Pesrin, a Dravathi, slate-purple skin already blanching toward gray, lifted his head from between his knees and stared at her. He had 4 eyes. All of them were dilated wrong, each pupil contracting at a different rate, which meant his nervous system was still recalibrating from the impact. "Light," he repeated, as if the word itself was the problem. Vale didn't answer that. She was already unbuckling, inventorying by touch. Survival pack under the co-pilot seat intact. Secondary flare kit crushed, the casing split and the chemical igniters exposed to air. Useless. The field torch clipped to the bulkhead rack had survived. She pulled it free, tested the beam against the far wall, strong, steady, maybe 60 hours of charge, and clipped it to her vest. Emergency med pack, she found it wedged under a bent floor panel, pulled it free. Basic trauma supplies, coagulant patches, analgesic hypos. Not enough, but not nothing. "Anyone with a functioning limb, stand up and come forward," she said. She said it the way she said everything. Flat, specific, stripped of anything that could be mistaken for emotion. 4 of them stood. Pesrin, weaving slightly but upright. Dr. Shale Ohmstree, the Galactic Ecological Survey's lead cataloger, a 4-armed Sorathi with 2 of her right arms hanging limp. The elbow joints bent at angles that said fracture, not dislocation. Mission Officer Kethrin, a broad-jawed Dravathi who outranked everyone on the shuttle and was bleeding freely from a gash above his ridge crest, the blood a dark violet that pooled in the creases of his uniform collar. And Technician Voss, the youngest, a Teshrani barely past his first molt, brown-furred, trembling so hard his claws clicked against the deck plates like someone typing badly. 6 survivors including herself, 1 human. "Where are we?" Kethrin asked. His voice had the particular flatness of someone deciding whether to panic. Vale pulled the emergency nav slate from its belt pouch. The screen was cracked but functional. She tapped through the crash telemetry, entry vector, atmospheric drag coefficient, surface composition at impact point, and then the planetary ID register. She read the data in 2 seconds, processed it in 3, and set the slate down on the co-pilot armrest. Vorith 7. The silence that followed had weight. Physical, measurable weight, like a pressure change you could feel in your inner ear. Pesrin made a sound, not a word, just a vocalization, the Dravathi equivalent of a man who's just been told the lifeboat is sinking, and the ocean is full of things that eat boats. Ohmstree's 2 good arms wrapped around herself, the Sorathi self-embrace that was half comfort and half preparation. Kethrin's jaw tightened until the muscles along his ridge crest stood out like cables, and he looked at the cracked windshield as if the planet might somehow look different if he checked. It didn't. Vorith 7 was a Class 22 ruin-grade world. The Galactic Ecological Survey had catalogued it 9 years ago from orbit, not from the surface, never from the surface, and immediately filed a permanent exclusion order. The survey notes were 3 sentences long. The first noted 17 confirmed apex predator species. The second noted that 11 of those species hunted by thermal signature during a 21-hour nocturnal cycle. The last sentence read, "No viable surface protocol exists." Vale had read that file. She'd read it the way she read everything the survey published about hostile worlds, carefully, critically, and with the quiet understanding that the people who wrote it had never set foot on a Deathworld and wouldn't survive a weekend on Earth. "The distress beacon is dead," she said. "The shuttle's primary reactor cracked on impact. I can smell the coolant. We have no power, no comms, and no way to repair either with what's on board. The Teleth Corridor shipping lane passes within detection range of this system every 19 hours. If we can get any kind of signal up, visual, thermal, electromagnetic, anything, the next ship through picks it up." She paused. "In 19 hours. 19 hours, Pesrin said. All four eyes blinked independently, which meant he was doing math he didn't like. "On Vorith 7, at night." "Yes." The cataloging team documented 17 apex predator species active during the dark cycle, Omstri said quietly. Her voice had the precision of someone who had memorized the data and now wished she hadn't. 11 of them hunt by thermal signature, 3 by subsonic echolocation. The remaining 3 by methods we couldn't identify from orbit. The survey drone sensors recorded movement patterns that don't correspond to any known hunting behavior. "I've read the catalog," Vale said. "Then you understand that surviving outside this shuttle for 19 hours on a Class 22 world during the nocturnal cycle is necessary." Catherine stepped forward. He was still bleeding, and his hand kept drifting toward the gash above his crest and then dropping away, as if he decided the wound wasn't worth acknowledging while larger problems existed. "Instructor Vale, I'm the ranking officer on this mission. The standard protocol for a Class 22 surface emergency is to seal the hull, activate the distress beacon, and shelter in place until retrieval. The beacon is dead. The hull has a breach I can fit my arm through," she pointed. The tier in the fuselage ran from deck to ceiling, 2 meters after the cargo bay door, a ragged mouth of torn alloy where the shuttle's frame had buckled on impact. Through it, the air of Vorith 7 was already seeping in. It was warm, thick. It carried something that smelled like copper and crushed vegetation, and underneath that, something else, a faint, acrid undertone that she couldn't identify, but that made the small hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "We seal that breach with what's available. We suffocate in 4 hours, she said. "The air recycler needs the reactor. The reactor is slag. Even if we could patch the breach, the atmospheric composition outside is 0.83 nitrogen, 0.12 carbon dioxide, and the rest is a mix of trace gases that will give us hypercapnic shock before we run out of oxygen." Catherine processed this. His expression shifted from authority to calculation. "Then we build a fire inside. We barricade the breach with cargo panels. We wait inside the hardened structure and fire inside a sealed space with no ventilation kills faster than the air going bad. Cargo panels are rated for impact absorption, not predator resistance. Anything on the exclusion list will go through a cargo panel like it isn't there. And barricading the breach with us inside means we can't get out when they come in through it." She let the last phrase hang for exactly 1 second, the way a good instructor lets a critical point settle. "When, not if. The thermal bloom from our crash impact will register on every heat-tracking predator's sensory apparatus within a 40-kilometer radius. That bloom is fading as the hull cools, but 6 warm bodies in a thin metal shell. That signal is getting stronger every minute. They're already coming." Nobody spoke. In the silence, Vale could hear the hull ticking as it cooled, and underneath that, the faint whisper of alien air moving through the breach. Something outside made a sound, distant, low, resonant. Not an engine, not wind, something alive. Vale reached into the survival pack and pulled out the field knife, 22 centimeters of hardened composite, designed for cutting webbing and prying open access panels. Not a weapon, not designed to be one. She held it up so they could all see it. "This is what we have. This, 1 field torch with 60 hours of charge, 4 chemical flares, a basic med pack, and whatever's in the cargo bay that the crash didn't destroy." "You're proposing we go outside," Pesrin said. His voice was thin. "I'm proposing we stop acting like this shuttle is going to save us and start building something that will." What could we possibly build on a Class 22 world in 40 minutes of remaining light that would protect us from 17 species of apex predator for 19 hours? A kill zone. She said it the same way she'd said everything else. No emphasis, no drama, a statement of fact like reading a line item off a supply manifest. Catherine stared at her. A kill zone. We have 40 minutes of light to prepare a defensive perimeter that channels any approaching predator into a controlled space where we can see it, predict its movement, and deal with it before it reaches us. I need terrain assessment, material salvage, and construction. That's what I'm trained to do. That's what I'm going to do. She met Catherine's eyes. You can help me build it, or you can stay in here and find out how long a cargo panel holds when something with 400-kilogram mandibles tests it. She picked up the survival pack, slung it over one shoulder, and walked to the cargo bay door. 20 seconds passed before she heard footsteps behind her. The cargo bay was half crushed. The shuttle had hit nose first and skidded, and the rear third of the bay had accordioned inward. Cargo crates and equipment racks folded into a compressed mass of metal and plastic. But the forward section was intact enough to work with. Vale did a rapid inventory. 2 intact cargo crates containing survey equipment, a rack of geological sampling tools, coils of cargo netting, restraint straps, and a portable atmospheric analyzer that was cracked but might still have useful components. She cataloged it all in her head, and then worked the manual release on the bay door. It ground open with a sound like tearing metal, and Vorith 7 hit her full in the face. Hot, humid. The copper smell was stronger out here, permeating everything, and the acrid undertone was sharper, some local chemical process in the soil, maybe, or a pheromone trail. The ground was dark basalt, almost black, shot through with veins of something luminescent. A faint blue-green glow pulsed irregularly through the rock, tracing patterns that looked almost vascular, like arteries in stone. Bioluminescent mineral deposits. The survey notes had mentioned those. They'd also mentioned that several predator species used the mineral glow to mask their own bioluminescent signatures while hunting. She stepped out and felt the gravity. Slightly higher than standard, maybe 1.15 G, noticeable but manageable. Her species had evolved at 1 G on a planet that routinely tried to kill everything on it. A 15% increase was an inconvenience, not a threat. The sky was the color of a healing bruise, deep purple-red at the horizon, darkening to near-black overhead. One of the planet's 2 moons was already visible, a pale sickle hanging low in the east. The other would rise in roughly 90 minutes. Between the 2 moons, the ambient light during the night cycle would be equivalent to heavy overcast on Earth. Enough to see shapes, not enough to see details. Enough to spot a predator at 15 meters, not at 30. She'd have to close that gap. Vale cataloged the terrain in 4 visual sweeps, turning a slow circle on the basalt. The shuttle had come down on a natural shelf, relatively flat, maybe 40 meters across, slightly elevated above the surrounding terrain. 3 sides dropped away steeply into ravines, choked with something that looked like vegetation but moved wrong. The fronds or tendrils or whatever they were shifted and curled independently of the wind, responding to stimuli she couldn't identify. The 4th side, the direction the shuttle's nose pointed, sloped gradually down into open ground. Level. Minimal cover. A natural approach vector for anything coming up from the lowlands. Perfect. Pesrin, she said, not turning around. I need every reflective surface in the cargo bay. Hull panels, equipment casings, the face of the atmospheric analyzer, anything that catches and redirects light. Strip them and bring them to me. Dr. Olmstree, I need the chemical composition of those bioluminescent veins. Specifically whether the glow intensifies with mechanical stress, what the spectral output is, and how long a burst lasts. Catherine, find me cable, any cable. Wiring harness, cargo netting, restraint straps, the tether lines from the geological sampling kit. Everything longer than 2 meters. She paused. And Voss. The young Teshrani was standing at the cargo bay door, his fur rippling in the hot wind, his claws still clicking against each other. He looked at her with eyes that were too wide and too wet. "You're going to dig," she said. "I'll show you where." They worked. Vale didn't supervise from a distance. She worked alongside them, faster, quieter, and with a specificity of motion that made Pesrin stop twice just to watch her hands. She cut cargo netting into strips with the field knife, knotted them into trip lines at ankle height, 30 centimeters off the ground, and strung them across the open ground approach at irregular intervals. Not to trip anything. The predators of Vorith 7 were too heavy and too low-slung for a tripline to stop. The lines were sensors. A claw catching a cable in the dark would vibrate the line at a frequency proportional to the mass of whatever had touched it. She'd feel that vibration through the attachment point, where the line was anchored to a rock she could rest her hand on. The reflective panels, 7 of them, stripped from equipment casings and the atmospheric analyzer's polished face, she positioned in a curved array along the ravine edges, angled to catch moonlight and redirect it toward the open approach. Not illumination. The redirected light would be too diffuse to see by. Disorientation. Any heat-tracking predator coming up the slope would hit a wall of scattered light reflections that would create contradictory input in its thermal-optical overlap system. The survey catalog had identified that as a theoretical weakness in the dominant apex species, a processing lag when visual input contradicted thermal input. 4 seconds of total sensory confusion. "How do you know this?" Pesrin asked. He was holding a panel in position while she secured it with stripped wire, his 4 eyes fixed on her hands as they worked a knot she'd tied 10,000 times in survival training and twice in real deployment. "Know what?" "That the Vorethian thermal hunters have a light scatter vulnerability. The catalog lists it as a theoretical weakness, unconfirmed. The research team that identified it was they didn't. They died before they could confirm it." Vale pulled the wire tight and tested the panel's angle. Moonlight would hit it in approximately 70 minutes. The reflective angle was correct. "I read the raw data they transmitted to the orbiting platform before they went dark. 23 minutes of continuous telemetry, including predator sensory response measurements during their final perimeter defense. The thermal-optical frequency overlap in those predators creates a processing lag when the visual input contradicts the thermal input. Scattered reflected light at the right angle does that. They had the theory right. They just didn't live long enough to build a working defense around it." Pesrin set the panel down and looked at her. In the dying light, his slate-purple skin had gone almost black, the color Dravathi turned when their circulatory system was prioritizing core organs over extremities. Fear response. "You read the raw data," he said. "Yes. Of a research team that was killed on this planet. Before I read the data, I read the casualty report. The team made 2 critical mistakes. They treated the shuttle as a fortress and retreated inside when the first predator appeared, which concentrated their thermal signature and eliminated their escape vectors. And they didn't establish any kind of perimeter before dark, which meant they were reacting to threats instead of channeling them." She looked at him directly. "We're not making those mistakes." She went back to work. Voss had dug where she'd told him 3 shallow trenches across the approach slope, each one 20 centimeters deep and 2 meters long, positioned to break the stride pattern of any 6-legged creature moving uphill. Not traps, speed bumps. A fraction of a second of altered footing, a moment where the predator's center of gravity shifted forward. That moment was all she needed. Ohmstree reported that the bioluminescent veins intensified dramatically under mechanical stress. Striking them with a rock or metal tool produced a burst of blue-green light lasting 4 to 6 seconds, with a spectral output centered on 470 nanometers. Bright enough to see clearly by. Bright enough to blind a thermal pit predator that wasn't expecting visual range input. Vale had Omstri chip loose a dozen fist-sized mineral fragments and positioned them at intervals along the perimeter, each one next to a marked stone she could find by touch in total darkness. Each fragment was a light grenade, throwable, reusable if it didn't shatter on impact. No charge, no mechanism, no failure mode except breaking. Emergency light sources from the planet itself. The first research team hadn't known about that. They'd run out of torch charge at the 11-hour mark. Vale wouldn't. The light died in stages. First the horizon went from purple-red to black, the color draining like fluid from a wound. Then the sky overhead lost its last trace of blue. The moons were fully up now, twin sickles, one pale yellow, one almost white, casting a doubled shadow field that made the basalt shelf look like a chessboard of dim light and deep black. The mineral veins pulsed their quiet blue-green wherever they surfaced, a web of bioluminescent lines that made the ground look like a circuit board someone had left running. Vale positioned her team. Catherine, you're inside the shuttle with the wounded. Dora and Mivrin can't move, and Voss stays with them. He's too young and too scared to be useful out here, and I need someone with working hands to administer the analgesic hypos if the wounded destabilize. Keep the bay door closed but unlatched. If something gets past me, you'll hear it coming. You won't need instructions. Catherine looked at her. Gets past you, he repeated. His voice was careful in the way that voices get when the speaker is trying to decide if the person they're talking to is brilliant or insane. Pesrin, you're on the starboard ravine edge with 3 mineral charges. If I call out starboard, you break one against the nearest exposed rock face. Hard. The flash will blind any thermal tracking predator looking up from the ravine for 4 to 6 seconds. That's enough. Enough for what? For me to reach it. Reach it, Pesrin said, with a field knife. Yes. Pesrin's 4 eyes did the independent blink thing again, each one closing and opening at a different speed, a Dravathi stress response that was half autonomic and half conscious. Instructor Vale. I've served in survey expeditions for 11 years. I've worked alongside humans before. I was posted with your Lieutenant Ferraro on the Kelith 9 mapping run. I've read the Galactic Classification Authority's reports on your species. I understand that humans have capabilities that other species find difficult to credit. But this is a Class 22 world, not a Class 12, not a Class 15, a Class 22 ruin grade. The apex predators here weigh between 400 and 800 kilograms. They have articulated mandibles that can shear through grade 6 hull alloy. They hunt cooperatively. And you have a knife that was designed for cutting seat restraints. Vale looked at him. In the moonlight her face was calm, not brave calm, not forcing it calm, not the constructed composure of someone holding themselves together through willpower. The kind of calm that comes from having already done the math and accepted the answer. The specific, bone-deep calm of a human who has weighed the odds, found them acceptable, and is no longer interested in discussing them. On Earth, she said, our ancestors hunted animals that outweighed them by a factor of 50. Megafauna, predators with claws longer than this knife and teeth designed to puncture bone. They hunted them with sharpened sticks, in the dark. For 200,000 years that was the job: go into the dark, find the thing with teeth, and come back with meat. She turned the field knife in her hand, tested its edge against her thumb, and a thin line of red appeared and was ignored. This is better than a sharpened stick. She walked to the forward edge of the basalt shelf, sat down cross-legged facing the open approach slope, and rested her hand on the anchor rock where the first tripline was tied. Behind her she heard Pesrin exhale, a long, shaking breath that carried no words. The first one came 97 minutes after full dark. Vale felt the tripline vibrate before she saw anything. The frequency was low and sustained, something heavy, moving slowly, testing the ground ahead with each step. Not charging, investigating. The thermal bloom from the crash site had been pulling them in from the moment the shuttle hit, but the wreckage was cooling fast in the night air, its heat signature fading into the ambient temperature of the basalt. The 6 warm bodies clustered on the shelf, though 37 degrees Celsius each, radiating infrared like beacons in a dark room. That signal was getting clearer by the minute. She didn't move, didn't reach for the torch, didn't shift her weight or alter her breathing. She sat perfectly still and let her eyes adjust to the moonlit slope below, letting the cones in her retinas do what 200,000 years of nocturnal predator-prey interaction had optimized them to do. There, it moved like oil poured over stone, low, broad, a body plan that suggested something between a lizard and a crab. 6 legs, each one articulated at 3 joints, the middle joints bending backward in a configuration that allowed the creature to flow over uneven terrain without raising its center of gravity. The head was a flat wedge, featureless except for 2 slits that pulsed faintly red thermal pits, each one sensitive enough to detect a 1-degree temperature differential at 20 meters. No visible eyes, no visible auditory apparatus. It navigated the world entirely by heat, and it was tracking the warmest thing on the basalt shelf. Sorry. Vale waited. The creature was 12 meters out, moving along the approach slope at a pace that suggested confidence. It wasn't stalking. It was approaching something it had already identified as food. It crossed the second trip line without triggering it, stepping over the cable with a precision that said it had felt the wire's thermal shadow against the slightly warmer basalt and adjusted its stride. She noted that. Noted the leg articulation, the stride pattern, the 4-step and scan rhythm, 4 paces forward, pause, thermal pits flaring as it updated its heat map. Intelligent, methodical, adapted to hunting warm-blooded prey in total darkness. That's a Vorethian glassjaw, Ohmstree whispered from behind her. The cataloger had refused to go inside. She was crouched beside the first mineral charge, her 2 good arms wrapped around her knees, her broken arms in their improvised slings. She was shaking, but her voice was steady, the professional in her overriding the animal. The survey listed it as the tertiary apex, approximately 400 kilos, armored carapace rated to grade 4 hardness, mandibles rated to cut through grade 6 alloy. Where are the mandibles? Folded under the head plate, they deploy forward when it commits to a strike, so it has to commit. Once the mandibles deploy, it can't retract and redeploy quickly. The data suggests a refolding time of 2.8 to 3.4 seconds. Call it 3 seconds, that's a long time. The glassjaw was 10 meters out. It had stopped, its thermal pits pulsing faster, the pulse rate increasing as it refined its lock on her heat signature. In the doubled moonlight, its carapace had a wet gleam, dark as the basalt, almost invisible against the ground. Evolved camouflage. If she hadn't been watching for it, tracking the faint red pulse of its thermal pits, she would have seen nothing until it was 5 meters away and already deploying mandibles. She stood up, slowly, deliberately, straightening from seated to standing in a smooth, controlled motion. She let the creature register the change in her thermal profile, the sudden expansion of her heat signature as her full body became visible to its pits. She wanted its attention fully locked. She wanted it committed to the approach. Then she turned on the field torch and aimed it directly at the creature's head. The effect was immediate and total. The glassjaw's thermal pits clamped shut, an involuntary reflex, the biological equivalent of slamming your eyes closed against a flashlight beam. The pits were designed to read subtle heat differentials, not to process the concentrated photonic output of a 2,000 lumen field torch at 10 meters. The creature's entire sensory apparatus went into overload. It froze, mandibles half deployed, legs locked in a wide bracing stance, every system screaming contradictory data. 4 seconds. The window the dead research team had predicted. Vale crossed the 10 meters in 3. The field knife went into the gap between the head plate and the first thoracic segment, a seam of softer tissue where the carapace plates overlapped. the only place on the creature's body that wasn't armored to grade 4. She'd identified that gap from the survey catalog's anatomical diagrams. She drove the blade into the hilt, twisted 45 degrees to sever the primary neural trunk, and pulled laterally to widen the wound channel. The glassjaw convulsed once, all 6 legs extending simultaneously in a rigid spasm, and then its body went slack with a sound like a sail losing wind. 400 kilograms of apex predator, dead in less than a second of contact, killed by a 22-centimeter knife and the thing holding it. She pulled the knife free, wiped it on her thigh, walked back to the shelf edge and sat down. Behind her, she heard Omstri make a sound that wasn't in any language she cataloged. "One down," Vale said. She rested her hand on the tripline anchor and faced the slope. The second came 14 minutes later. Another glassjaw, this one larger, maybe 500 kilos, with a head plate that was scarred and pitted from years of territorial combat. An older specimen, more experienced. It approached from the starboard ravine rather than the open slope, climbing the rock face with a fluid 6-legged efficiency that said it had hunted elevated terrain before. Climbing prey was not new to it. Vale called the direction. Pesrin broke a mineral charge against the rocks, and the burst of blue-green bioluminescent light froze the creature mid-climb. Its thermal pits slamming shut against the visual overload, its mandibles locking half-extended, its grip on the rock face suddenly uncertain as its proprioceptive system lost its thermal reference frame. This time she had to work harder. The ravine edge was uneven, the rock face wet with condensation, and the glassjaw was clinging to vertical stone 3 meters below the shelf lip. She went over the edge feet first, controlled her descent with one hand on the rock, found the creature's carapace with her boots, and used its own body as a platform. It was still alive, still frozen in the sensory overload window. She could feel its legs trembling against the rock, trying to resume function. The knife went into the same anatomical gap, head plate to thorax, neural trunk severed. The glassjaw released the rock face and fell into the ravine, 500 kilos of dead weight crashing through the vegetation below with a sound like a building collapsing in slow motion. Vale pulled herself back up to the shelf lip with one hand. Pesrin was standing 3 meters back, all 4 eyes as wide as Dravathi physiology allowed, his slate-purple skin gone the color of dry ash. "You went over the edge," he said. "That's where it was. You stood on it, on the predator, while it was alive. It was disoriented. The mineral flash gives me 4 seconds. I used 2. She walked back to her position and sat down again. The tripline was still vibrating faintly from the impact of the glassjaw hitting the ravine floor. She waited for it to settle, then rested her hand on the anchor rock. The third predator was not a glassjaw. It came from the open ground, moving fast enough that the tripline sang instead of vibrating, a high, tight frequency that meant speed and weight. Bigger, different body plan entirely. Vale was on her feet before it crossed the first reflective panel line, and what she saw made her pause for the first time since the crash. Upright bipedal. Something like a wingless bird scaled to 3 meters tall, but with proportions that were wrong for any avian analog. The legs were too thick, the torso too broad, and the head was mounted on a short muscular neck that could swivel a full 360 degrees. 2 forward-facing eyes that glowed amber in the moonlight. Not thermal pits, actual eyes. It saw her immediately, and it didn't stop. The scattered moonlight from the reflective panels caught its eyes and it flinched, but only flinched. The amber glow dimmed for a fraction of a second and then came back brighter, the pupils contracting to pinpoints as they adjusted. This one didn't navigate by heat alone. It had high-acuity visual processing. The light scatter trick wouldn't work. "What is that?" she said. Not alarmed. The tone of a specialist encountering something outside her dataset. I don't know," Omstri said. The cataloger's voice had lost its professional steadiness. It doesn't match any species in the Vorath 7 catalog. All 17 listed apex species were documented from orbit. This one, it must have been below the survey drone's detection threshold, or it wasn't active during the observation window. It's uncatalogued. Bigger than the glass jaws. Significantly, 3 meters tall, bipedal with forward-facing binocular vision that suggests depth perception and distance calculation. A pursuit predator, not an ambush specialist. The creature was 20 meters out and closing. It moved in long, rocking strides, each step driving its clawed feet into the basalt hard enough to leave visible gouges, deep parallel scratches carved into rock that was harder than most structural alloys. Its head was narrow, almost elegant, but the mouth was hinged along a jaw line that ran all the way back to the posterior skull plate. When that jaw opened fully, it would expose a gape wide enough to close around her entire torso. Vale made a decision in half a second. Everyone inside the shuttle, now bay door closed. You said the shuttle wasn't safe. Inside now. They moved. Olmstre grabbed Pesrin's arm with both good hands and pulled. Voss, who'd been watching from the bay door, disappeared inside like a brown furred blur. Catherine had the bay door release in hand before they reached him. Vale stayed. She pulled one of the mineral fragments from its position, hefted it, roughly a kilogram, dense, warm from the fading residual heat in the basalt, and threw it hard to the creature's left. It struck exposed rock 12 meters away and burst into blue-green bioluminescent light, a flare that lit the open ground in ghostly aquamarine for 4 full seconds. The creature didn't flinch. Its amber eyes tracked the light source, processed it, dismissed it as non-threatening, and came back to her. It hadn't even slowed. Visual hunter, not confused by light tricks, not distractible by secondary stimuli. Fast, strong, focused, and smart enough to prioritize. Vale felt something settle in her chest. Not fear, she'd cataloged fear in survival training at 18, mapped its physiological markers, and learned to set it aside the way you set aside a tool you don't currently need. Not excitement, something older than both. A recognition. The same recognition that had settled into every human who had ever stood in open ground at night and watched something large with forward-facing eyes come toward them. The understanding, quiet, ancestral, pre-verbal that she was not prey. She had never been prey. Her species had spent 200,000 years in the dark with things like this, and they had come out of it as the thing the dark was afraid of. She clicked on the field torch and held it low, aiming the beam at herself rather than at the creature. Let it see her clearly. Let it process what she was, warm-blooded, upright, small, holding tools that weren't claws or teeth, standing perfectly still while everything else on this planet ran. The creature slowed, 15 meters, 12. At 10 meters it stopped. Its amber eyes were fixed on her face, not on the torch, not on the knife, on her eyes. It was reading her the way a predator reads another predator, assessing threat posture, calculating metabolic cost, weighing whether the energy expenditure of a fight was worth the caloric return of the meal. Vale didn't blink, didn't shift her weight, didn't alter her breathing or her heart rate or the micro-expressions on her face. She held the creature's gaze with the same flat, measured, absolute calm she'd held every other moment since the shuttle went down. The torch light carved shadows under her cheekbones and turned her pupils into dark points of stillness. The creature made a sound, a low, tectonic vibration that she felt in her sternum more than heard, a frequency that was probably a dominance display or a territory assertion. Its jaw hinged open an inch, showing teeth that were translucent, needle-fine, and layered in rows that went back 4 deep. Then it closed its mouth. It took 1 step back, then another. Its amber eyes never left her face. At 15 meters it turned, not fleeing, retreating. The distinction mattered. A fleeing animal runs because it's afraid. A retreating predator walks away because it has done the math and decided the cost is too high. It walked back down the slope, its massive clawed feet leaving grooves in the basalt, and disappeared into the dark beyond the reflective panel line. Vale stood there for a full 30 seconds, listening. The night sounds of Vorath 7 were layered, insect-analog chirps at multiple frequencies, the rustling of the motile vegetation in the ravines, something that might have been wind through a canyon system to the east, the distant crack of thermal expansion in cooling rock. No heavy footsteps, no triplines singing. She sat back down and rested her hand on the anchor. The night went on. They came in ones and twos after that. 3 more glass jaws over the next 4 hours, each one drawn by the growing thermal signature of 6 warm bodies that refused to disperse. Each one neutralized the same way, torch beam to overload the thermal pits, 4-second window, close and cut. Vale didn't rush any of them. She waited for each approach, identified the attack vector and the specific variant size and carapace condition, created the sensory overload window, and closed the distance with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. By the 5th glassjaw, a juvenile, barely 300 kilos, that had come up the slope so quietly she'd identified it only by the tripline frequency, she had refined the technique to a single continuous motion. Torch on, step, close, blade into the headplate gap, twist, withdraw, step back. 2 seconds of contact. The blade went into the same anatomical point every time, the same angle, the same depth. She'd found the gap and she used it the way a surgeon uses a well-known incision. No hesitation, no variation, no wasted motion. Pesrin spelled her on mineral charge duty during the middle hours. He'd stopped asking questions. He sat at the starboard ravine edge with 3 fresh charges lined up beside him and watched her work with an expression that had moved past fear, past awe, past the Dravathi emotion she'd once heard translated as category failure, the feeling of watching something that cannot fit into any classification system you possess. At the 6-hour mark, Ohmstree came out of the shuttle. "The wounded are stable," she said. "Technician Dora has a spinal compression fracture, but she's conscious and her extremity function is intact. Researcher Mivrin has bilateral arm fractures and a mild concussion." She paused, and her voice changed, shifted from clinical report to something quieter. "They can hear the sounds, the impacts, the sound the predators make when they go down. They asked me what you're doing." "Tell them I'm establishing the perimeter." "You've established it 5 times over. The basalt in front of the shelf is—" Ohmstree stopped, looked down the slope at the shapes visible in the moonlight. Dark mounds on dark rock. "Instructor, there are 5 dead apex predators on that slope." "6. The second one went into the ravine." Ohmstree stared at her. In the mineral glow, the Saratha's 4-armed silhouette, 2 arms in slings, 2 arms wrapped around her torso, looked like something from a temple frieze. A deity with too many limbs watching something it hadn't created. "You're not defending us," Ohmstree said. "You're hunting them." Vale considered this for 2 seconds. "Both," she said. "They come because the thermal signature draws them. I can't stop that, we can't mask our body heat with what's available. But every predator I take down adds a scent marker to the perimeter. Death scent. Specifically, apex predator death scent. On Earth, most apex species will actively avoid a territory where a competing apex has been killed recently. The death scent signals that something more dangerous than them occupies this ground. You're marking territory. I'm telling them what I am." Ohmstree sat down beside her on the basalt. Her broken arms hung in their slings. Her 2 good arms rested on her knees, and her hands were steady. "The uncatalogued one," she said. "The bipedal, it turned away from you." "Yes." "That shouldn't happen. An apex predator at the top of a Class 22 food chain doesn't turn away from a potential meal. It has no natural predators. There's nothing on this world that should be able to intimidate it by standing still. There's nothing from this world that could." The quiet that followed was a different kind of quiet. Not shock, not the stunned processing of someone watching the impossible. Understanding, the sound of a dataset being revised in real time. "I'd like to record the predator encounters," Omstree said. "For the ecological survey, the glassjaw thermal scatter vulnerability is now confirmed. Your field data validates the dead team's theoretical model. The uncatalogued bipedal species needs formal documentation. And the behavioral data, the retreat response, the apparent threat assessment of a human by a species that has no evolutionary experience with humans, that's significant. Possibly the most significant behavioral observation in the survey's history. Record whatever you want. I'll also need to revise the exclusion order." "Will you?" "The current order states that no viable surface protocol exists for Vorith 7. Omstree looked at the slope, at the dark shapes of dead glassjaws arranged along the approach like markers along a road. That assessment was made without a Deathworlder in the dataset. Vale didn't respond. She was watching the slope. Something had moved at the far edge of the reflected moonlight, a shape, low and wide, bigger than any glassjaw she'd killed tonight. Much bigger. And behind it, the mineral veins in the basalt were pulsing in a pattern she hadn't seen before, rhythmic, coordinated, as if something very large was moving through the substrate below, and its passage was disturbing the bioluminescent deposits. "Stay here," she said. She stood up and walked down the slope. The creature emerged from the dark like a geological feature becoming visible. It was that large, 8 meters long from head plate to tail segment. 6 legs, each one thicker than her torso, planted on the basalt with enough force to leave permanent compression marks. The same flat wedge head as the glass jaws, but scaled up massively, with a secondary crest that fanned out behind the skull like a shield or a crown. The crest was bioluminescent, pulsing the same blue-green as the mineral veins in complex shifting patterns that might have been communication, might have been territorial display, might have been something else entirely. An alpha, the thing the glass jaws served as forward scouts for. The mandibles were already deployed, not half deployed like the juveniles, but fully extended, each 1 meter long, serrated along the inner edge with cutting surfaces that gleamed in the moonlight like wet metal. They moved independently, opening and closing in slow testing motions, the way a human might flex their fingers before gripping something. Vale stopped 10 meters from it. She could feel the ground vibrate with each of its breaths, not just its steps, its breaths. 800 kilograms at minimum, possibly more. She turned on the torch. The alpha's thermal pits didn't close. Not entirely. They narrowed, filtering the light input, adjusting their sensitivity in real time. This one had either learned from the deaths of its scouts, had read their death scent and adapted, or it was simply old enough that it had encountered anomalous light sources before and developed a compensatory sensory response. The 4-second window wouldn't work. Vale processed that fact in the time it took her to breathe in and breathe out. No window, no exploitable sensory weakness. 800+ kilos of armored apex predator with fully deployed mandibles and a head plate she couldn't cut through with a plasma torch, let alone a composite knife. She looked at the creature. It looked at her. Its thermal pits pulsed, reading her body heat, her heart rate, the micro-variations in her skin temperature that mapped in real time to her neurochemical state. It would find no fear. There was none to find. Vale reversed the knife in her hand, blade along her forearm, edge facing out, the grip her unarmed combat instructor had called the surgeon's hold. Close range only. Fully committed. You didn't use the surgeon's hold unless you intended to be inside the thing's reach and stay there until the job was done. She took 1 step forward. The alpha's crest flared, the bioluminescent patterns shifting from slow pulse to rapid strobe, blue-green light washing over the basalt like foxfire. A warning display. The first warning display she'd seen from any predator on Vorith 7. Everything else had simply attacked. This one was giving her a chance to leave. She took another step. The mandibles opened wider, each serrated edge catching moonlight. The creature's 6 legs shifted into a bracing stance, weight low, center of gravity forward, the rear legs digging into the basalt for traction. Ready to charge. Vale took a third step, and then she did something that nothing in the Vorethian ecosystem's 3-billion-year evolutionary history had ever encountered. She ran at it. Not away. At it. Full sprint, straight line closing, the field knife held along her forearm and her body dropping low as she covered the gap. The torch beam bounced with her gait, strobing across the creature's head plate, and she watched its mandibles track her, track the heat, track the movement, the serrated edges scissoring to intercept her center mass. At 3 meters she dropped. Not a stumble, a controlled slide on the basalt, legs forward, back flat, her body passing under the mandible strike that closed on the air where her torso had been a quarter-second earlier. The mandibles snapped shut above her with a sound like industrial shears cutting cable, and then she was under the creature, looking up at 800 kilos of armored predator from below. The one angle it could not defend. The field knife found the ventral seam, the gap between the thoracic plates on the underside, where the carapace segments overlapped to allow the body to flex during movement. Softer tissue. Vascular. She drove the blade in with both hands, dragged it forward along the seam for half a meter, and rolled clear as the alpha's legs buckled. It went down in stages, front legs first, then the middle pair folding sideways, then the rear legs giving way with a grinding sound as 800 kilos of mass settled onto the basalt. The crest flickered twice, a strobing blue-green pulse that lit the entire slope in cold, bioluminescent light, and then went dark. The mandibles retracted slowly, like fingers closing into a fist for the last time. Vale stood up. She was covered in the creature's circulatory fluid, dark, faintly luminescent, smelling of copper and ozone. The field knife was still in her hand. The edge was notched now. The ventral seam had been tougher than the head plate gap. She'd need to reshape the blade if anything else came. She walked back up the slope. Pesrin was standing at the shelf edge. He'd watched the entire thing, the charge, the slide, the kill, and all 4 of his eyes were open as wide as Dravathi physiology permitted. His mouth was moving without producing sound. Vale sat down in her position. She pulled a small sharpening file from the survival pack, began working the notch out of the blade and faced the slope. 7, she said. Nothing came for 90 minutes after that. The thermal signature of the alpha's body was changing the chemical profile of the entire slope, not just predator death scent, but dominant apex predator death scent. The glass jaws that had been circling at the edge of her detection range pulled back. She could hear them, the faint vibration of heavy bodies moving cautiously through the ravine vegetation, but they didn't approach. They had read the scent and made their calculation. She'd done what she'd told Omstri she was doing. She'd told them what she was. Kethrin came out at the 14-hour mark. He'd cleaned the dried blood from his crest and fashioned a proper bandage from cargo liner. He looked better, steadier, more himself. He stood behind her and looked at the slope for a long time, at the dead glass jaws arranged in a rough semicircle, at the massive body of the alpha sprawled across the approach like a barricade of armored chitin and dark fluid. Instructor Vale. Officer. In my 32 years of service with the Galactic Ecological Survey, I have filed threat assessments on 409 species across 67 worlds. I have classified predators, cataloged weapon systems, and rated planetary hazards from Class 1 garden worlds to Class 20 frontier zones. He paused. In 32 years, I have never once had to create a new classification category. She didn't look at him. I'm creating one now, he said, not for the predators, for you. Vale said nothing. She was listening to the night. It was quieter now. The insect analogues had stopped their chirping within 50 meters of the shelf, driven to silence by the chemical saturation of apex death. The only sounds were the wind through the ravine vegetation and the distant crack of basalt cooling in the night air. At the 17-hour mark, the amber-eyed biped appeared again. It stood at the far edge of the slope, 30 meters out, 3 meters tall, silhouetted against the second moon as it began its descent toward the western horizon. It looked at the dead Alpha. It looked at the perimeter of dead glass jaws. It looked at Vale. Then it sat down. Not an approach, not a retreat, not a hunt posture. It settled onto its haunches at 30 meters and watched her with those amber eyes. And Vale understood what it was doing because she would have done the same thing. It was acknowledging her, the way one apex predator acknowledges another, not with submission, not with challenge, not with the ritualized displays that lesser predators use to establish hierarchy, with the simple, quiet recognition that they occupied the same tier, that neither of them was food, that the appropriate response to encountering something equally dangerous was to sit down and watch. She watched it back. Two hunters, sitting in the dark on opposite ends of a basalt shelf on a Class 22 world, separated by 30 meters, and the mutual understanding that this was not a contest either of them needed to have. The first moon set. The second drifted westward, pulling its light across the ground in a slow tide. The mineral veins pulsed their quiet blue-green beneath her boots, and somewhere in the ravines, the glass jaws retreated further. At 18 hours and 43 minutes, Pesrin's voice came from behind her, tight with something that might have been relief or might have been a different kind of fear. Signal, I'm reading an electromagnetic signal. The instructor Vale, there's a ship, Teleth Corridor, just entering detection range of the system. Their broadcasting standard approach hails on the emergency frequency. Light a flare. He lit one. The red chemical light arced into the rust-colored sky and hung there, a point of crimson against the bruised-dark canopy, painting the basalt shelf in emergency red. Across the slope, the amber-eyed biped rose to its feet, regarded the light for a long moment with those steady amber eyes, and then turned and walked into the dark beyond the panel line. It didn't look back. The rescue shuttle from the cargo hauler Pellin's Grace touched down 41 minutes later, its landing lights turning the entire shelf blinding white. The pilot, a Tessarhi, compact and efficient, with the quick assessment eyes of someone who landed in bad places for a living, stepped out of the airlock and stopped. She was looking at the slope, at the 7 dead predators, at the perimeter of triplines and reflective panels and bioluminescent mineral charges, at the Alpha's massive body blocking the approach like a monument, at the human woman sitting at the shelf edge with a field knife across her knees, covered in dried alien circulatory fluid that faintly glowed, watching the dark with eyes that hadn't closed in 19 hours. What happened here? The pilot asked. Catherine answered. He was standing behind Vale, and his voice had the particular steadiness of a man who has made a decision about what he witnessed and will not qualify it for anyone. A Deathworlder happened, he said. Revise the exclusion order. Vale stood up. She folded the field knife, clipped it to her vest, and turned off the field torch for the first time in 12 hours. The dark of Vorith 7 pressed in from every direction, the ravines, the open ground, the sky with its bruise-colored horizon just beginning to lighten in the east as the planet's 21-hour night cycle neared its end. She walked past the pilot toward the rescue shuttle without looking at any of it, the same flat, unhurried stride she'd used walking down the slope toward the Alpha, the same stride she'd used walking out of the cargo bay into the last light. No hesitation, no backward glance. The walk of someone who had never once, in 19 hours of darkness on a Class 22 world, considered the possibility that the dark was something she couldn't handle. Behind her, on the slope, the scent of what she'd done would keep every predator on Vorith 7 away from that shelf for weeks. The basalt would hold the gouges from the Alpha's legs, and the faintly luminescent stains from its circulatory fluid long after the scent faded. Years from now, The Galactic Ecological Survey would send a second team, properly equipped, with heavy weapons, shielded shelters, armored vehicles, and every advantage the first survey team had lacked, and they would find those stains. They would find the trip lines still strung across the approach, and the reflective panels still angled to catch moonlight that would never arrive in quite the right configuration again. And in their revised report, filed under a classification heading that hadn't existed before, they would note that the permanent exclusion order for Vorath 7 had been amended. Not because the planet had changed, not because the predators had become less lethal, because the dataset had been updated to include a variable that no previous survey had accounted for. Somewhere in the dark beyond the shelf, the amber-eyed biped watched the rescue shuttle's engines ignite. It watched the lights rise into the rust-colored sky, growing smaller, and vanish into the brightening east. Then it turned and walked back to its territory, past the dead Alpha, past the scent markers, past the gouged basalt where the human had sat for 19 hours and taught the dark to be afraid of the thing sitting in it. It did not return to that part of the shelf for a very long time.